The Xbox controller has been one of my main go-tos, and for good reason. It is an excellent one-size-fits-all controller that's the result of years of evolution and refinement, and I want to trace back how that happened. Today's video is sponsored by Best Buy. While the last decade of Xbox controller redesigns have been relatively subtle, the first couple designs that were released for the original systems were quite different. In particular, the original Xbox controller, more affectionately recalled as the Duke, which was, simply put, massive. Other controllers of the time seemed absolutely minuscule compared to the gigantic size that the Duke brought to the table, and that's really become part of its longest lasting legacy. So much so that we've even got to the point where we have re-released versions of the Duke that you can now use on modern systems. The thing is though, while its popular legacy is that gigantic size, I really do think it actually is a very important controller for how it laid the foundation for what the Xbox controller is today. And even more so, I think it's actually really impressive what ergonomics that controller had considering its large size and the fact that it was actually kind of forced to be this way. See, the development of the Duke actually happened a little bit outside of traditional order. Before the actual controller itself was designed, the internal circuit boards were mocked up and already ordered en masse, and turns out that because of the fact that it was a single layer rather than a dual layer design and was trying to support all the features that the original Xbox controller was having added on, the resulting board was already larger than basically every other controller on the market at the time. This put the Duke's lead designer, Denise Chaudhary, in a kind of weird situation where she had to work with this already massive internal system and had to build a comfortable, usable controller out of that. And with that constraint in mind, I think it's actually really impressive how ergonomic the Duke really is. If you had particularly small hands or you were a kid, it was still an absolute nightmare to use, but outside of that, it's actually pretty impressive how comfortable it was to be able to reach the left and right sticks, being able to use the ABXY buttons. Everything was still in a totally functional working distance, just on an overall much larger controller than most people were used to. Size aside, the design of the Duke controller was really a culmination of combining factors from multiple popular controllers that came before it, offering 6 front-facing face buttons with the ABXY and the black and white buttons, a pair of pullable triggers, and a set of sticks that could be used, although unlike a lot of other designs at the time, the sticks on the original Xbox controller were offset, which has been one of the ongoing kind of defining features of Xbox controllers versus some other brands out there. The Duke also boasted one particular feature that I absolutely loved for its time, a breakaway cable. Being someone who grew up with plugged-in controllers and absolutely running into the issue of every now and then maybe carelessly tripping on a cord and ripping a system out of an entertainment center, the idea of a breakaway cable where it would actually just snap off from the front and leave the system where it was a revelation. It also happened to be just in time for wireless controllers to become very standard not too many years later, but still, it was great. Now, the Duke is not the only controller that the original Xbox had. There was also the much smaller S design that was originally designed for specifically the Japanese market when the Xbox was released there. But when worldwide, a lot of people saw this smaller design, and while the Duke had its supporters, a lot of people did not really care for the massive size at the time. There was a lot of demand to bring that controller elsewhere, and eventually that did happen with it becoming available internationally on its own, and eventually also became the new bundled-in controller option for the original Xbox, replacing the Duke entirely. The S had a noticeably smaller design that juggled around some of the inputs. The black and white buttons were now moved from above the ABXY buttons to below. The start and select buttons were moved over to the side of the D-pad in similar fashion, and it did feature a different D-pad design as well. The Duke offered a kind of wavy design that Microsoft had used on some of their past PC controllers, whereas the S controller embraced a more traditional D-pad design that featured a webbing around the sides that favored rolling and 8-way inputs. While the Duke had its diehard supporters at the time and is absolutely the more iconic controller nowadays, at the time the S was absolutely cemented as being the more popular option for users once it was released. Both of these controllers are very important to Xbox's history. Obviously, they were the first ones that the original Xbox had, but it's actually what came after them that I think is arguably the most important controller that Xbox has ever released. Before we get to that though, I do want to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, as well as a great place to grab a brand new Xbox controller if you need one, Best Buy. Best Buy is the place to go for all your gaming needs. Not only do they carry all the latest stuff, but it's super convenient thanks to things like online ordering and same-day pickup. You can grab just what you need, like an Xbox Series S. The most affordable way to get into the latest generation of gaming, the Xbox Series S gives you access to the full library of Xbox Series S and X games, Xbox One, and select games going all the way back to the original Xbox. offering full feature support like Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos, up to 120 frames per second in some games, and super fast loading times thanks to an SSD. Even better, alongside the Xbox Series S, you can also grab Xbox Game Pass Ultimate. When combined, you're able to access a huge library of games that is constantly changing and evolving at an incredible price. Make sure to check out the link down below to learn more. Now let's talk about some controllers some more. Every controller redesign has come with its refinements and upgrades, but I really do think the most important one that Xbox released was the original 360 controller. This further shrunk the controller down just a little bit more than the S to a size that is very familiar with today's controllers, and it cemented what is now really the standard Xbox layout. The black and white buttons were removed from the face and instead replaced with the two shoulder buttons on the left and right. The Xbox logo, which is now also a button, was placed on the middle of the controller, with the start and select buttons placed on either side of it. We continue to have the offset sticks that the original controllers introduced, and like with the S controller, the D-pad has embraced that web design. While there are of course more changes that came after this initial controller still lines up really similarly to what we're seeing today. There are refinements, there are upgrades, but the general basic concept has remained. Another important update that came to this controller was its changes to connectivity. Instead of just being a wired-only option like on the original Xbox, the 360 controller came in a wired and wireless option. The wireless option ran off of AA batteries with this very obvious battery bump on the back, while the wired design would just plug directly in and most importantly, changed from a proprietary design like on the original Xbox controllers over to a USB, opening up the controller's use from being something exclusively for an Xbox system and now making it something that you could also use on a PC, and really, for a lot of people I know, became the gold standard for PC controllers for a long time. To this day, I know people that use the wired 360 controller as their PC setup for playing games on pad, and I know multiple people who would still be using it to this day if it wasn't for the fact that their original controller that they bought back in 2005 finally broke after a decade later. Unlike the original Xbox controller, the 360 controller never really received any kind of massive change in design, but there was one alteration that happened near the end of the system's life cycle with a new design that featured primarily a change to the D-pad. Basically, instead of just being forcefully only the web design that the 360 controllers had, these later ones gave you the ability to twist the D-pad to swap between either that web design or a more traditional plus-shaped design. Truth be told, I don't think this actually made that massive of a difference in inputs because the underlying switches were the same, but I also completely fell in love with this controller when it was revealed. I'm also a sucker just for silver controller designs, so this was something that I had to grab right away, and it did become my primary 360 controller for the rest of the life cycle, and I have it to this day. While that individual change is pretty minute, I actually think it is a pretty important one because it gives just a little bit of a hint of where Xbox was going in the future with the Xbox One controller. This is where we really get a controller that is basically the one we have today. There's some further changes that come after this, but the Xbox One controller really does solidify the grip shape and general design that the Xbox controller has. Its curves are a little calmed down compared to the 360 controller. It no longer comes in a wired or wireless design, instead just being wireless alone. The battery door has been redesigned to where it's hidden away much better rather than being this protruding pack on the back, and it added more rumble motors inside the controller, giving a little more variety to how rumble could feel in games rather than just the kind of mad shaking that the original controllers or 360 controller would have. The Xbox One design also ditched the webbed pattern for the D-pad that the 360 had in favor of a more traditional plus-shaped design, like what the silver controller was adding as an option. From here on out, while there are updates and changes, they're a little more subtle over time, and I really think the last major important change comes with the first redesign of the Xbox One controller. This is where they kind of change the look up a little bit. They get rid of that segmented look that's at the top of the controller in favor of something that looks a little more smoothed out, and most importantly, add Bluetooth connectivity to the controller. The original Xbox One controller only did a dedicated wireless signal that was an Xbox design. You could still use it wirelessly with PC if you bought a separate adapter, but Bluetooth really did open it up as something that could be used with a lot more devices, whether that's a PC or even a phone or tablet. And it's also with this redesign where we really see Xbox start to take off with variety. The original Xbox and 360 controllers did come in a couple different colors over time. There were some limited edition designs, but the later years of the Xbox One controller is really where Xbox just goes all out. tons of different colors, different patterns, different sets of controllers that have shared themes, multiple special edition controllers celebrating different games with all kinds of different unique little touches, whether that's the glow-in-the-dark paint on the Sea of Thieves controller or various little hidden surprises that you could find in some of the other ones. This is where aesthetics and personalization really become a big aspect of the Xbox controller, where it's not just about having something that's functional and comfortable, but also having something that reflects your personality a little bit more, to the point where they even eventually launched Design Lab where people could just design their own. It's also during this time that Pro Controllers become a thing. Initially, Pro Controllers are really this popular concept of third-party companies taking OEM controllers and modding them, customizing them, adding things on to make them better, and Microsoft's response is, well, we can just do that ourselves and sell it at a lower price point. So we get the Xbox Elite controller, adding all these additional functions and new features. Swappable sticks, back paddles, trigger stops, the ability to swap between two different D-pads, where again, you have that plush-shaped design, and instead of the old web design, they introduced the faceted D-pad, which we now know as the D-pad design for the current Xbox controller. And even the Elite has already displayed that it's kind of going through its own changes and evolution, as we have the Elite 2, where it added profiles, a rechargeable battery, and even more ways to customize the controller. And then finally, this brings us to the current Xbox controller, one that's really just referred to as the Xbox controller, as they've rebranded everything to being more about just Xbox as a family rather than any individual specific system like the Series X or Series S. Visually, these are very similar to what Xbox has been doing since the midpoint of the Xbox One days, but there are some light changes here and there. The D-pad is now that faceted design, which personally I really like, and I'm so glad is now the mainline direction. And there's also just been a general light redistribution of weight and changes to the internals that just make it feel a little more comfortable to use in the hand. Like I said at the top end of this video, it's my main controller that I go for. I not only use it with the Xbox, but it is also my main controller on PC as well. I just think it is a wonderfully balanced design that is comfortably used for a long period of time, and I'm really curious to see that after all the changes that the Xbox controller has gone through over the past couple decades, where it could possibly go next. Whether that's certain features that we've seen on the Elite controller become mainline on standard ones, like some back button additions, whether it's adding additional features that we've seen in other controllers out there, like more refined rumble. Again, it is already a fantastic controller, but of course there is room to grow, and I can't see what form it takes next. So that was just a quick little look back at how the Xbox controller has changed over the years. Again, I want to thank Best Buy for sponsoring today's video. As always, if you enjoyed the video, hit that thumbs up button to let me know, or thumbs down if you didn't. It's good for me to know. Subscribe if you haven't yet, and I will see you guys later.